the 2019 Wilderness Issues Lecture Series. My name is Joanna Campbell, and I'm the Director of Education Programs for the Wilderness Institute, which is part of the Franke College of Forestry and Conservation here at the University of Montana. This year's theme is titled Wild Hope. Fearless risk-takers, art makers, and storytellers on the wilderness and conservation frontlines. This series explores myriad ways people of different wilderness and conservation backgrounds navigate these challenging and difficult times. As I shared last week, this year's theme purposefully expands the boundaries beyond wilderness because we do find ourselves in a time and place where hope needs space to roam, where hope is not siloed. I'd also like to thank MCAT for being here recording the lecture tonight. And if you would like to stay informed about upcoming Wilderness Institute lectures and events, there is a sign-up sheet circulating the room, and please feel free to leave your information. Also, next week, I invite you to attend the third installment of this series with Marianne Bongiorni, who's a professor of art here at the university, and she will discuss the tensions between concepts of wildness and westernness through her work as a conservationist and artist. So, tonight, we have the internationally renowned Martin Nye. He is here for his talk entitled Public Lands, A Love Story. Martin is a professor of natural resources policy and director of the Bollé Center for People and Forests in the Franke College of Forestry and Conservation. For 20 years, Nye's research and writing has focused on public lands and wildlife policy, law, planning, and conflict. He is a recent recipient of the University of Montana's Distinguished Teaching Award, a special recognition based on a history of excellence in classroom teaching, and given to professors who have demonstrated a quality, long-term impact on their students. As appointed by the Secretary of Agriculture, Nye served from 2014 to 2018 on the U.S. Forest Service's National Advisory Committee focused on national forest planning. Nye received degrees from the University of Nebraska and Northern Arizona University. He loves to ski as much as possible with his son Joe, float wild rivers, hike, hunt, and fish the mountains of Montana, and mess around in his garage, listen to this, listening to vintage country and rock and roll. He also enjoys photography, playing hockey, Irish whiskey, and strong cheese. Yep. So, for tonight's talk, I asked Martin to come out of his comfort zone and provide a more personal talk about public lands and share his personal and professional experiences as an academic. I think he's forgiven me for asking me to do this. I think we're in for a real treat. Please join me in welcoming Martin Nye.
Thanks, Joanna. Is this on? Thank you, Joanna.
Oh, let's try it. Technology. There we go. There we go.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank all of you for coming out tonight. It's really appreciated. I'm going to begin with some disclaimers. First, I am not a fearless risk-taker, art maker, or storyteller on the wilderness and conservation front lines. Second, I'm speaking for myself and not for the University of Montana or the Montana University system. And third, I'm a poor bowler. And it is here with this slide that I'd like to begin my talk this evening. This is Montana State Senator Jennifer Fielder. As many of you know, the senator has played a leadership role in seeking the transfer of public lands to the state of Montana. She is also the CEO of the American Lands Council, an organization based in Utah advocating the transfer of federal lands to the states. Federal public lands, more than 600 million acres, 28% of the United States, roughly half the West, and 29% of Montana. Beginning in 2012, Western state legislatures, other than California, reinitiated old efforts to transfer federal lands into state ownership. This began as a litigation strategy, with transfer advocates challenging the constitutionality of federal public lands. These arguments went nowhere fast, and so the movement then pivoted to the political arena, with bills introduced in Western state legislatures and in Congress that would transfer federal lands to the states or permit their disposal to private interests. The latter came as little surprise given that recent Republican Party platforms have explicitly called for the privatization of public lands. Now, while all of this is going on, there are more heavily armed developments unfolding in other parts of the West, from the Bundy family and standoff in Bunkerville, Nevada, to the armed occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. Now, the political backlash to the so-called land seizure movement was severe. Nowhere was this more evident, more successful, and more flannelized than in Montana. And its Patagonia/Carhartt/Blaze Orange coalitions of conservation, hunting, angling, and recreational interests. And this successful backlash has largely stymied efforts in Congress and in state legislatures to transfer ownership of federal lands to the states. But the threats to public lands are just as acute today. What we're seeing now are efforts to transfer the control rather than the title of federal lands to the states. These bills and related efforts coming from the executive branch would radically alter the traditional paradigm of federal lands management and the constitutional principle of federal preemption by making federal laws subservient to state interests. Let me provide you a few quick examples. First is the Federal Land Freedom Act, which would give states, quote, exclusive jurisdiction over the leasing, permitting, and regulation of oil and gas activities on federal land while also exempting the program from administrative and environmental laws. Another bill, the National Monument Creation and Protection Act, would limit the presidential authority to designate national monuments and require the consent of a state governor, legislature, and county, quote, within whose boundaries the national monument will be located. These bills will not progress any further in the Democratic-controlled House, but there are similar efforts being advanced in the executive branch, such as the Secretary of Interior's memorandum focused on wildlife management on federal lands. This memo orders all interior bureaus and offices to better align federal wildlife regulations and policies with the preferences of the states. So as with that background, I'll go back to this setting. This bowling alley is in the basement of the Sun Valley Lodge, where the senator and I were invited to address state senate presidents from across the country about our very different views of public land law and management. With no word of bowling, the organization hosting the event invited us to a pre-debate function that included free appetizers and alcohol. And that's how I'll introduce myself in this photo, as my motor skills might have been diminished at this point in the evening. And once this threshold was crossed, the organizers announced the bowling part of the night, and I learned that I'd be bowling impaired for the future of public lands. What you can't see in this photo is that the senator and I were neck and neck and way ahead of the competition, which included an assortment of corporate lobbyists who attend these events. It came down to the final frame, and I lost by a single pin, and the humiliation and ensuing nightmares are very real. Our debate the next day went as expected. The senator, as do others in the land seizure movement, tell a dystopian, post-apocalyptic story of purported federal mismanagement, and most importantly, a story based in fear. Her PowerPoint scene looked like Cormac McCarthy's novel, The Road. Burned forests, foreboding, smoke-filled dark skies, dead, fire-charred animals, and all the other depictions found in this subgenre of science fiction. And fiction it is, as it is a story devoid of any reality-based legal, economic, or scientific analysis. It is the same dark fiction and affront to truth that so poisons our politics today. Still, to this day, transfer advocates have avoided the tough policy questions and trade-offs that are inherent in managing public lands in a democracy. How would these lands be managed exactly? How would the management be paid for? Not answered. And this evasion is why people, for good reason, suspect that transferred lands would quickly become private lands. The policy questions have not been answered because it is far easier to disparage, undermine, underfund, and campaign against federal land agencies than to actually govern and sort through the difficult choices and trade-offs that must be made in federal land management. Now, immediately following the debate, I was confronted by a Western state senator whose name I will not reveal. He took issue with my characterization of federal lands case law. You know, those inconvenient cases making clear that it is Congress and not his state legislature that have the authority over federal public lands. Not interested in the details, the senator at least admitted to me his disdain for the judiciary and the rule of law. I don't care what the Supreme Court has to say about public lands, he said. Weird, I thought. Given his position in a constitutional system with checks and balances and separation of powers. But what he did next stuck to me in a more personal way. He kept asking me where I was from, where I grew up, how long I've been in the West, how long I've been in Montana. Are you an outsider, an other? And so on. It was not friendly, and it started getting uncomfortable. And given my post-bowling mood, I pushed back. Are you suggesting, Senator, that I don't have a legitimate voice in the future of our public lands, our national public lands? He refused to answer, but there was no question about his motivations. And his position aligns with others in the land seizure movement and the American Lands Council, whom explicitly state that public lands don't in fact belong to all of us. So I've reflected. I'm Irish and I know how to hold a grudge. That's the truth of the matter. I've reflected about the Sun Valley experience, and I'd like to use it as a way to provide a counter-narrative. A narrative that is more hopeful, and one based on a position of love rather than fear. And that is where my Nicholas Sparks-like title, Public Lands, a Love Story, comes from. Our deeply personal, place-based, collective love stories about public lands will, in the end, protect this legacy and nurture a more grassroots, youthful, pro-public lands movement. Like so many of you in this room, public lands are deeply personal to me. It is why many of us moved west, stay west. They are what makes the West the West. Public lands hold my most precious memories of my son. On this trip into the Great Burn, we were awoken in the middle of the night under a full moon by a moose running through our camp, running right through our camp, cannonballing into the lake beside us. Once our heart rate settled, we snuck out of the tent into the bushes and watched him swim from shore to shore. And I'll never forget that moment. That moose, that moon, my son. On this trip, my son learned that it might not be a good idea to sleep with a jacket full of beef jerky and candy bars in grizzly bear country. And I've learned some valuable lessons on public lands as well. On this trip, for example, I learned that olive oil does not, in fact, moisturize badly burned lips, having run out of chapstick. It actually cooks them. My experiences with him on the public mountains of Montana. Times of loss and adversity on our public lands. Of recovery and impromptu dance recitals on sandy beaches. Of discovery and adventure. Public lands where you can feel like the worst hunter in the world. Of friends, like this rare photo of a human Yeti hybrid enjoying a cold smoke and a soak on public lands in Montana. Some profound experiences. And I think some of these experiences were so profound that I can't remember them at all. And to make it even more personally revealing, I feel wealthy on our public lands. I wasn't born into a family with money or land or exclusive access, but I nonetheless have 600 million acres of opportunities on our shared lands, in canvas and under the stars. Leopold got it right again in asking, what avail are 40 freedoms without a blank spot on the map? Now, for some of our native neighbors, these places are more than personal. They define them as a people. With roots so deep, their legal rights on some of these lands are time immemorial. Consider, for example, the Blackfeet Nation and its multi-generational fight for the sacred Badger II medicine, its cultural repository, spiritual backbone of the world. A place still threatened by oil and gas development. An image forever burned in my brain is when the attorney representing one of the oil and gas companies from Louisiana testified before the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. In doing so, he showed a map of the Badger II Medicine and the Hall Creek lease area. But unbeknownst to him, he displayed the map upside down. Quietly, without a word, a Blackfeet leader walked up to the front of the room and turned the map right side up. And went back to his seat and listened to the attorney talk about private property rights, unfairness, and how the destruction of the badger could be mitigated. So whenever you feel like giving up, consider the temporal scale of which native nations like the Blackfeet or Kootenai neighbors to the north or our Nez Perce neighbors to the south have been connected to a piece of land or species, like bison, like salmon, and how long they have fought for their protection. These stories and your stories are what give me hope about the future of public lands. Admittedly, hope can be difficult today. The new Gilded Age, the corporate capture of our public agencies, the assault on our democratic norms and institutions, the denigration of the rule of law, the hyperpolarization and partisanship of our politics, and the deconstruction of our administrative state. The last 2 years have been overwhelming. 143 significant deregulatory actions taken by this presidential administration, according to the Brookings Institute. Many of these actions are working their way through the federal rulemaking process and can be easily tracked. But in addition are executive orders, Congressional Review Act nullifications, legal guidance revocations, weird policy memos, sketchy agreements and MOUs, and so on. And I am not talking about a normal and healthy dial tuning and tension that is to be expected between Republicans and Democrats and shifts in power. I'm talking about something far more radical and unprecedented. Actions that undo long-standing and bipartisan principles and practices of conservation, such as the de-designation of national monuments, monuments established under the 1906 Antiquities Act, or such as interpreting the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918 to no longer prohibit the unregulated killing of birds. The latter is so egregious, so out of the norm, that it was protested by a far-ranging group of Republican and Democratic Senate-confirmed political appointees and former career civil servants within Interior, going all the way back to the Nixon administration. 17 former officials working for Presidents Nixon, Ford, Carter, Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, all of them asking, what the hell is going on? That is what makes the last 2 years different. Now, I hit my professional low 2 years ago upon the release of a draft of this article. The funder of our research described the piece as 2 parts NyQuil, 1 part Red Bull. And the NyQuil comes in our review of federal land laws and regulations and policies pertaining to wildlife management. In reviewing these systems, we show that federal land agencies not only have the discretion to manage and conserve wildlife on federal lands, but often an obligation to do so. So to make a long story short, the Forest Service was not pleased to learn that it had the legal authority to manage one of the multiple uses in 2 of its governing statutes. So concerned was the agency that it asked me and my dean to remove the draft article from the Boley Center website. I refused, and Dean DeLuca, seeing it as academic censorship, refused as well. Thank you, Tom. So the Forest Service proceeded to terminate my research contract and funding, providing 3 bogus reasons and 3 letters of justification. And here I'll show you this interesting link where you can make a donation to the Boley Center. Joking aside, I get where the cynicism and frustration comes from, but I am hopeful for our public lands, and I'll finish by telling you some of the reasons why. First, and this is going to sound pandering, but it's not, are my students. Never in my career have I seen students so interested and so engaged in public lands law and policy. The Keep Public Lands in Public Hands, I'm a Public Landowner, and related campaigns are working and seem to have cut across some of the identity-based tribes that I usually see in my classroom. And they still argue about how to best balance resource use and protection. That's the practice of conservation. But they don't want anyone messing with their public lands inheritance. Second, and what my students seem to understand more than most, is the increasing significance of our federal public lands as more non-federal lands are lost to development. It's a compensation principle. We could talk water, recreation, or wildlife in this context. Take the national significance of federal lands to wildlife conservation, for example. They are refuges of biological diversity, an essential habitat for our charismatic megafauna, and what Patty Limerick calls the uncharismatic minifauna. as these numbers attest. So the history of public lands provides my third reason for hope. Hard as it is to believe today, public lands have long been a unifying force in the United States, for the nation as a whole. We can trace this back to the U.S. Constitution itself, as one way it strengthened national unity was via the Property Clause, giving Congress the authority to, quote, make all needful rules and regulations respecting the lands and property belonging to the United States. Public lands have not always been such a partisan battleground. Republicans had much to do with the acquisition, retention, and conservation of federal lands. From their role in creating the National Forest System, to using the Antiquities Act, to passage of the Wilderness Act and Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and so on. Republicans, though not always a great way to gauge consensus, we could also consider the final votes on some of the environmental and public land laws that seem so controversial today, such as the Wilderness Act or the Endangered Species Act. The latter signed by that tree-hugging socialist. Public lands as a unifying force for the nation. We see the evidence of this in all of our federal public land laws, from the Preservation-Oriented Wilderness Act to our utilitarian multiple-use laws. All of them calling for the management of public lands to be in the national interest and for the benefit of future generations. Public land advocates must own this language and more clearly explain why federal public land is in the national interest, past, present, and future. The history of public lands, even their dark side, given its roots in Indian territory, is nonetheless national history, not the history of any particular state. And since the acquisition and retention of these lands, the national government and generations of American taxpayers have financially invested in developing, managing, protecting, and restoring these lands. I'm hopeful because the land seizure movement awoke a beast, a part of the national public that became complacent about our shared public lands heritage. Our democratic institutions and public land laws also provide reasons for hope. These laws are far from perfect, and in a politically sane world, we could constructively discuss how they could be improved and made more efficient. But shortcomings aside, many of them provide the tools, oversight, public participation, and accountability mechanisms that are collectively saving our asses right now. Thus far, for example, the Trump administration's deregulatory efforts are not doing well when challenged in court, with one tally by the Institute for Policy Integrity showing 2 wins for the administration and 28 losses. In this context of public lands law, I also find hope in the fact that there are feasible solutions to some of the real problems that do in fact exist on our federal public lands. I'm a policy nerd, and this is what I do during the day. And this is what my students want to talk about. Real solutions to real problems, not ways to use public lands as a political wedge. This is why I committed 4 years to serving on the Forest Service's National Advisory Committee, focused on forest planning, in order to work with others, including those I disagree with, in finding more enduring solutions to public lands management. So I'll close with a thought from the Zen master. No, not this Zen master, but Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who teaches the 4 aspects of love, all of which flow from understanding each other. Man, are we on the left and the right in desperate need of this council right now. This really hit me after reading Hal Herring's remarkably insightful piece on the armed occupation of Malheur. There was no sugarcoating here, and Mr. Herring spends considerable time exposing some of the dangerous crackpots drawn to Malheur. Like moths, he says, drawn to a halogen light. But he also tried to understand some of the more personal and often financial hardships faced by these men in an unforgiving global economy, and the economic challenges found in our rural communities, communities that we cannot forget. So I find hope in just the offering of understanding, flowing from a love of place, public land places, a sort of prayer flag. This letter provides an example, and rarely have I ever been so moved by a gesture. It is from Jack Wallace Gladstone to Sidney Longwell, the owner of Solonex in Louisiana, the corporation suing to lease oil and gas in the sacred Badger II Medicine. Mr. Gladstone writes of the power of the Badger, its story, and urges Mr. Longwell to do what other leaseholders have done, which is take advantage of the withdrawal legislation passed by Congress and exchange his claim for opportunities in, quote, far less spiritually rich landscapes. But it's this last paragraph of his, this offering from the heart, that I want to leave you with tonight. Sidney, my home is on the Blackfeet Reservation. I may not have all the amenities of the big city, but a pot of coffee is always on and a meal never far from the stove. I invite you to visit me here to deepen our understanding of each other's motives and visions regarding the Badger II Medicine, Hall Creek wildlands. We can break bread, share stories, and walk together upon this land we both treasure. We may learn from each other. Regardless of your response or the outcome of this issue, I do and will always consider you a brother. Grandmother taught me well. Thank you, Jack Wallace Gladstone, and thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And so we do welcome your questions, your comments for Martin. Yeah. You have the floor. Your hand.
I can just go home, too.
No. Yeah, please.
Is much of that legislation, executive orders and things like that has gone down in the last 2 years, is it reversible when sanity returns to Washington?
Well, that's this is my comfort zone now. I'm talk policy, so this is, it's complicated. So I think the probability now with divided government, the probability of any significant substantive changes to legislation is very low. Forget the numbers. Out of those 143 significant deregulatory actions, I think roughly 80 of those are in the federal rulemaking process. And as I mentioned, the Trump administration is not faring well in that APA process. Some of these have kind of been slapdash and not the most carefully constructed rules. Disallowing public participation and sufficient public comment and insufficient analysis. So not faring that well. The executive orders and some of these other issues are a little more complicated to trace, and it's a little too soon to tell. The one example I used is that policy memo from Secretary of Interior Zinke to all federal bureaus and offices to basically realign federal laws and regulations with the preferences of the states. That is still like a lot of these executive orders, all of our federal land agencies are trying to figure out what to do with these orders. That had a 90-day, I think it was a 90-day, Sandy, it was something like that, 45 or 90 days to report back. And then, so we're waiting for that to happen, and then litigation will commence shortly thereafter. So it's an open question. I've never in my career seen anything like it in terms of the scope of change. So you can look at the Congressional Review Act nullifications, all of the policy memos that are coming out, legal guidance revocations. It's a lot to keep up with.
If by some miracle the current administration is found to be criminal, then could some of the things that they've done, or all of the things that they've done, been eliminated because it was done by a criminal group?
I have a feeling I'm going to punt on a lot of questions tonight. But I know that there's a lot of people in this room that would love to answer that question. I'm like, I've caused my dean enough trouble in 2 years. You see how behaved I can be.
He's shocked.
Follow up with a more concrete sort of trajectory of the migratory bird chapter order. If you've been keeping up on that, I know there's litigation pending and states have just gone nuts, like California, for example, said we're still treating habitat destruction as a take under our equivalent of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act.
Yeah. Well, Sandy Zelmer teaches wildlife law over in the law school, so you can talk about this too. I mean, I don't know. I used it as an example. I was trying to consider what I feel are some of the most, I'll just stand back. I mean, so it doesn't look so partisan, right? Like, I expect some dial tuning between the parties. And you can kind of look back through conservation history and say, you know, we might err on the side of protection, resource use. But I think what a lot of scholars and others would argue when they look at the scope of change with the Trump administration, that this is something far different. So I thought the Antiquities Act would be a good example of that. I mean, it's never been tested. We're going to find out what the courts have to say about it. But the official response from 17 former officials, high-ranking Senate-confirmed officials, taking issue with an unprecedented interpretation of the word take in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which has been settled, relatively settled law for some time, I felt really kind of would give you all a sense of why this is so fundamentally different. But I don't know, like a lot of these, I'm unsure of exactly where it is in the queue. And this has been an interesting opening for the states to push back against the Trump administration, like California has on multiple policy fronts.
What's the driving force behind all these changes? And, I mean, who's getting rich? It's got to be money, right? I mean, where did it come from?
Yeah.
I know. Well, this is hard, and I'm not ready. That's the second installment of this talk, I think, I'm trying to wrap my head around some of the larger, I mean, I get that. I mean, there's no doubt that we're seeing, you know, the acting Secretary of the Interior in his ties to oil and gas industry. And so I see where you're coming from, and I'm very sympathetic. But I think that there's even larger sort of institutional issues that I'm trying to get my head around, and that goes well beyond public lands to get into where American democracy is headed, right? This degree of partisanship that our system of governance is not really designed to deal with. Never mind the degree of intense hyper competition that we're seeing between the two parties. And so I think the point that I really wanted to impart tonight is that if somehow, and again, I have not really figured out how to do this, if we can remove public lands from these very dangerous pendulum swings that we're seeing between Democratic and Republican administrations, I think it would be beneficial. And I think that's why I'm hopeful, because if we cast back just a few decades, we see that these issues were not so partisan. And so how can we regain that radical middle, that center? Certainly it will benefit conservation, public lands, wildlife. Yeah. So I don't have a real cogent.
Yeah. Let me draw you out a little farther on that.
Yeah.
Given the overwhelming majorities that voted for the Wilderness Act and the Endangered Species Act and a number of others of that same period, do you see unifying principles that existed at that time that either A, have decayed since and resulted in much wider polarization, or were the principles that provided those majorities back then perhaps on a poor foundation that disguised a division that we didn't recognize? And if so, what do you think those principles were?
And this is off the record, right? This is deep background? I have witnesses, Rob.
I was invited by your director.
No, I'd love to talk about this. I mean, my co-author and I, Chris Barnes from the BLM, talked a lot about this when we wrote a piece on the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act. And, passage, that's kind of, it's a data point, and it is interesting to see the final votes of the Wilderness Act and to consider both Republican, like John Saylor from Pennsylvania, who was such a conservationist, who played such a big role in passage of the act. So I think that's an important point. But I'm not trying to, it's more complicated, right? I mean, passage of the Wilderness Act, Georgia, was 8 years, 65 different bills, I believe, that worked its way up until 1964. So there was a lot of compromise and log rolling and everything else. But those compromises were written right into the Wilderness Act statute. And so what Chris and I argue in the wilderness context is that something fundamentally changed in the early 2000s when all of a sudden people started to question, is this compromise enough? And wilderness became, and nowhere else in Montana do we know the story to be more true with Tester's bill. But all of a sudden we started to see these quid pro quo deals in terms of wilderness legislation, and the compromise kind of went to a different level. And so Chris and I sort of speculate that maybe when we look back at some of those early wilderness bills in the 70s and even 80s, there was a degree of sort of comity in the Senate where you might get a relatively clean wilderness bill in Arizona, but the deal was to get a water bill, like the Central Arizona Project or something like that, right? And all of a sudden we start seeing the whole packaging of this conservation legislation look pretty fundamentally different. And then, again, this is a long-winded answer, so I apologize, but you can trace Pew and others have traced the degree of hyper-partisanship since that time. So I think, why would we be surprised to think that all of these issues, of this hyper-partisanship is not impacting public lands management and policy at the same time?
Just sort of an observation, following up on Rob's question, I guess, is, it's interesting whenever we talk about, the landmark conservation statutes, we have to go back about 40 years to hit the most recent one. And there was a period when we got a lot of really good national conservation legislation, 60s and 70s and the very early 80s. And there hasn't been really anything since then. And I find it really odd. But then I sit back here listening, and I was just going through my head, so what kind of really grand conservation legislation or ideas or proposals are out there being talked about and pursued? I can't come up with one right now. So it just seems like in the whole society that it's not just the legislative body that has changed. It's not just the polarization. It just seems like somehow we've lost the momentum.
Well, another can of worms. It hasn't been just the Republican or the most recent administration in Congress has been, forced some forms of privatization and private control of public federal lands. Even Democratic legislators, state and local, and I guess we're talking mostly federally, helped pass laws that have really weakened public participation. And I wonder if you could just, so people understand that that's happened, talk about some of these things like the categorical exclusion expansions, good neighbor authority, that kind of thing. This has really been happening a lot in recent decades, even under Obama and before. And things like, well, the latest is like 3,000-acre clear cuts, no real analysis on national forests. That's huge. But that got started, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, Patrick and I in this paper, this state and local, tracing this recent development, because we felt, one of the things that was happening was that the media, because all of these bills at the state legislative and the congressional level, following Chavitz's defeat in Utah, that the media sort of lost interest in the story, and the bills went down in flames for the most part. But we were seeing, for us, was even a more dangerous sort of pattern. And so we try to sort of deconstruct this, and we put it into the context of federal public lands law, which is complicated in terms of, and we, Jeff, I think we might disagree on, I'm with you completely on what's happening to NEPA, a death by 1,000 cuts. So I think we're in agreement there. But, the area of federal public lands law already, we believe, provides a very legitimate, privileged voice for state and local governments. They're found in our existing statutes. That's cooperative federalism, all of which have savings clauses and coordination provisions and cooperation provisions. Congress recognizing back in the 60s and 70s that states should have a privileged seat at the table when it comes to managing federal public lands. And I'm thankful those provisions are there. And so what we do is sort of trace that development and show, wow, what's happened really since the 60s and 70s are both Democrats and Republicans have increasingly given state and local governments increasing power. And this is still not enough for the current Republican Party. And so we draw a line. We talked about good neighbor authority and some of these other recent initiatives that we felt were kind of dial tuning. I mean, I see where some concern might be in all of these. But the cases that we selected, the 5 or 6 bills, Patrick, that we discuss in this paper, are in a completely a different league altogether. And I don't know how to get my head around all of that, other to say that the Democrats have consistently moved in the direction of giving state and local governments more authority, and it never seems to be enough. And that should be some concern, because those statutes, like, again, one of the points I'm really trying to hit home is that the history of public lands is about the national interest and future generations, not the interest of any one particular state, never mind county. Yeah, would you want to add anything to that?
Well, I'm not sure that what you're disagreeing with, how you see me disagreeing. What I'm saying is the rollbacks on NEPA to me, and I don't think people understand how it's been just eroded piecemeal, piece by piece over the years, to limit public participation periods, to expand the types of industrial extraction that can go on without full-blown environmental impact statements and public involvement. So that's the kind of thing that I see as private interest influencing legislation to, increase their private control, not necessarily ownership, but private control that is so anti-democratic.
Yeah, I will agree. And that is a theme we've seen over the last 10 to 15, 20 years. And we can talk of the forest context alone, which I believe is it's only 2%, I believe, the last Government Accountability Office report shows that of NEPA-related decisions are actually environmental impact statements. The rest are a collection of environmental assessments and categorical exclusions. So we're seeing this in a lot of different contexts.
Thank
you. Yeah, George?
No judicial review is being added to a lot of these numerous bills. How do you get past that? It can't be taken to work with no big means of how to do that.
Well, a lot of the bills that we've tracked that limit judicial review in both the National Forest Management context and public lands have not become law. What am I missing in terms of recently enacted statutes limiting or expediting judicial review? So I'm not sure if I can think of an example right now.
The Real ID Act and the border stuff.
Yeah, some national security issues. Sandy?
Forest Restoration Act, some of the categorical exclusions you talk about cut out some assessment administrative appeals and really truncate what can be done by way of judicial appeals.
Yeah.
What was that, 2006, that statute?
Yeah, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act is an example, but that doesn't preclude judicial review, but it does try to sort of nudge the courts in a direction to say, we'd like you to better or consider short-term and long-term values and so forth, expedite decision-making. But I've never seen any sort of empirical study to show if that's influenced the courts at all. One, because the Healthy Forest Restoration Act has been so rarely used, actually. But I'd have to think of more examples. But we are definitely seeing the limitations on judicial review in proposed legislation.
Right. And I think it has a lot to do with wildlife issues, too.
You talked about state policies or states not having policies when trying to obtain federally owned land. Have there been any states that have proposed a policy?
In terms of how the lands would be managed?
Yes.
No, this to me is I've had 3 debates now with Senator Fielder. And each time I think I'm going to come back stronger and really try to figure it out and hit the audience right and everything else, and hasn't worked that way. It's difficult because the Senator and the American Lands Council, nor any state that has introduced transfer legislation, has actually told us how transferred lands would be managed exactly. And for a policy nerd like me, that's really frustrating. They haven't even answered the question of whether or not transferred lands. So the case that is typically made is that we're going to show how inefficient our federal land agencies are. They lose money, bloated bureaucracies, and then they contrast those federal land agencies to the purported efficiency of state trust lands. Our school trust lands here in the state of Montana, for example. which are not public lands. Almost every Western state says somewhere in statute, regulation, or policy that state trust lands are not public lands. State trust lands are managed for a particular beneficiary as a trust to generate revenue for common schools. They're not multiple use public lands as typically understood. So it's a bit of a shell game in terms of how the land seizure movement has tried to sell the idea of transferring federal public lands when they've refused to answer any of the real significant questions that come along with federal public lands management. How will the ESA be dealt with? It's no longer Section 7. It will be Section 9 no-take provision, which is very expensive. How are the states going to pay for that? What about all of the abandoned mines found on federal public lands? What about reserved water rights? What public participation mechanisms will be provided? What planning mechanisms will be provided? Will they be subject to balanced budget requirements? Ballot initiatives? What am I missing? How about, exactly. And so all of these questions have been refused to be answered. And so for good reason, the public asks or believes that those lands are not going to be transferred. They're going to be privatized. So I still have not seen, and we've tracked this movement since 2000. I've tracked it since 2012 and repeatedly have asked Senator Fielder and others to answer those questions, and they failed to do so. And that's what my students want to talk about, because there are real problems on our federal public lands. And we could identify issues like economic inefficiency on our federal public lands and come up with real solutions. Let's have a royalty on hard rock mineral development, for example. That's an interesting solution. Raise grazing fees. We could do it the same way the states do it. Right? Or, you know, Senator Fielder and the American Lands Council often talks about, oh, the states aren't listened to when it comes to federal lands planning. Well, we could identify those cooperation and coordination provisions in federal statutes, and there's scholarship basically showing the states have not used the existing processes to make their case in federal lands planning. So that's what's frustrating for me, that there are real feasible solutions to some of these problems. That was a long answer. I'm sorry. I should have just said they have not answered. I don't know. Yeah, George.
It seems to me like Senator Daines is kind of posturing around land and water conservation fund reauthorization right now to distract from the fact that their WSA bills failed miserably. And I could be wrong. I'm wondering if that's kind of the case. And to appear to take a more moderate stance on public lands and policy generally in order to basically just reintroduce wilderness study area bills that would fail to compromise in the way that the last ones did, which I think is a big part of why they failed, or in my opinion anyways. And so I just wonder, tactically, what can be done preemptively. And one thing I wonder is, could Tester introduce a bill that preemptively sort of tried to establish some of the compromise that people wanted to see in the Daines and Gianforte bills that weren't there, and just wondering what your perspective is.
Yeah, and George, I'm actually okay with boundaries, and so I'm going to punt on this because I feel like there are so many veteran conservationists in the room that work with the delegation and know more political tactics than I would, so I would just give you pure speculation at this point, not knowing. But I think it's a really interesting question. And I won't make eye contact with those veteran conservationists in the room, but we do have an interesting question. Rob, can you go on the record and... I don't know, George, what's going on. Yeah. I stopped getting involved with, and this is part of my sort of personal journey through public lands. I was going in that direction at one point in my career and asked to testify on the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act by Senator Tester. And I had already put in a year's worth of research on place-based legislation, and I had significant concerns about going in that direction and asked to testify. And while I admired the senator for getting involved in wilderness politics, I was fundamentally opposed to that approach to wilderness legislation. And that pretty much ended my relationship with Senator Tester and his office. And so ever since, I've avoided questions just like that. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Yeah, Dave. I was thinking about your really touching stories about your personal connections to public lands through your family and lots of great experiences in the outdoors. And I think probably everyone here shares those stories. And I was thinking about another article by Hal Herring and some cases that he's made to me and to my students about the lack of connection to public lands as public lands among many people who now are, legislatively opposed to them. It's sort of based on the case that it's hard to make a living in a small community surrounded by federal lands when the capacity agencies is kind of cratering to hire people, and lots of forest jobs are being taken by immigrant visas that are much lower cost. That the public lands have ceased to be kind of the engine of economic salvation for lots of small communities, and that's really fueling this antipathy to having them run by the federal government. And I just wonder if you think that's a valid point, and if there's sort of a policy response or some political response that sort of gets at that issue.
Oh.
That's why I remember hating you in class so much. No, I'm a work in progress. This is all a work in progress. I haven't read that piece by Hal, but the work coming out of Headwaters Economics, this is kind of a more policy-ish economic answer, but the Malheur thing made sense in terms of, because Ray Rasker's outfit and Headwaters clearly show that there are huge economic benefits that come out of public lands in public, and especially wilderness areas, and protected land designations are hugely advantageous to those counties. But if you play around with his data set, I forget what that's called, it's really neat though. You can look per county, and there are counties like around Malheur that have been completely left out. And that's why his story in High Country News just sort of blew me away, because he sort of traces, like a lot of people in Malheur they were part of the lunatic fringe, clearly. And so he dispenses with those stories. But then he does focus on some really touching stories by these all white men, essentially, that have lost their jobs, and turns it around to say that these public land, they actually enjoy these public lands, right? And I think the message I want to send to all of this is that we can't forget about those people. And that was that message, something I'm just trying to learn myself, is that message from Jack Gladstone. Instead of just working at this meta policy level, is to remember these people and these communities and have a more heartfelt approach. But I'm going to leave it to others in terms of how best to make these economic connections. And I mean, we could go down that road and talk about stewardship contracting, and I would love to write the new book on new rules for public lands. But I'm not sure I want to do it in today's political context. right? I don't think there's any doubt that from an academic standpoint, we'd like to see laws that promote resiliency and deal with climate change. And so many of our statutes, like the National Forest Management Act, are exclusively focused on timber, almost all timber. And so many of our issues now are motorized recreation and all of these other issues. So you can kind of look at these laws and say, if it was a safe place and we could redesign some of these public land laws, we might be able to do a better job of actually promoting endangered species recovery. And at one point in my career, I thought the way to do that was by convening another public lands law review commission, as long as I was on it, and do this. But I feel like today it's so poisonous and so toxic and so partisan that I'm uncomfortable even talking about revisiting some of our foundational environmental laws.
So, for everybody, it's very easy for people in, say, Missoula to get passionate about federal public lands, but for everybody who does have a lot of these spaces, and rightfully so, there are plenty of people who live in places like Chicago or St. Louis or Baltimore who don't really have the means, who might never set foot in these spaces based on geographic or financial barriers. So I'm wondering, what is the value of these spaces for people who might never have a direct experience with them? Why should they care?
Yeah. When are you going to cut off the questions?
You get to decide. This is your
I'm okay with like one more, I think.
Okay. All right.
I don't know. It's funny. Like I admit that I focus on certain issues that I'm really comfortable. That's why this was so difficult for me, right? That and when I was on the Forest Advisory Committee, I was a little skeptical. We talked so much about youth engagement, urban engagement, and it bored me to tears. But over those 4 years, and the group that was working on it, Candace Price, who does Urban Outdoors out of Kansas City, for example, tells these amazing stories that run on Kansas City television, and trying to make some of those connections. So there's people out there doing that. Maybe a utilitarian way of doing that is just tracing watersheds. I mean, I don't know politically if that works, but I mean, that's a story that's pretty easy to tell with, Brian, how much of our water in the West, in urban West, originates from our national forests. I believe it's something like 50% or more.
It's around there, and just the virtual water story of how water all over the West impacts people across the country and the continent.
Yeah. So maybe the water guy can sort of answer that question in terms of connectivity. Yeah. That is a lame answer, but I'm sorry. Who else? Can someone answer that question? Yes, thank you. Oh, well.
I'm not from Montana, so my opinion doesn't matter.
Okay.
But I grew up in the St. Louis metropolitan area, like all 20 years of my life. And I think it also depends on your upbringing, obviously, what your values are. But growing up, I always see, like, I hadn't seen mountains until I moved here for college last semester. And I think for me, it's just like that sense of wonder and that sense of majesty. And I'm an archaeology major, so I also care about living like people did in the past, so I can experience that and be able to interpret how that would be to people today and relate it to modern society. But there's like that sense of wonder, even when you're from a city, and it's so bogged down with how busy it is and how smelly it is and how everything's just like smog and terrible and no one wants to talk to each other, and there's just that lack of community, even though there's so many people together. And I think that just the idea, thinking of this wide open space where you can just be you and be who you want to be, is enough for people to care. And again, it depends on your upbringing and what you believe personally, but just from someone from the metropolitan area.
I think that's a great note to end on.
Well, we have one more. I don't know. I'm really worried about this last one.
we keep coming back, or I keep coming back to this concept that's often talked about across so many disciplines, including conservation, which is resilience. And you mentioned it just a minute ago. And I keep coming back to the question as to whether or not our institutions and our sort of, natural resource governance system more broadly is resilient to all of the things that are going on right now, the death by 1,000 paper cuts, for example. I'm just curious as to your reflections on that idea of institutional resilience around natural resource governance.
Yeah, I wrestle with it because I'm so damn defensive sometimes about our federal environmental laws. I've written pieces that have been critical of some forms of collaboration and some backsliding on these bedrock environmental laws. But like I mentioned, where would we be today without those statutes? I mean, it's hard. I mean, my God, it's like the word arbitrary and capricious is divinely inspired right now. Like, thank the Lord for the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946. And, I've reflected a little bit about, I think, our multiple use statute, though archaic in so many ways, has proven resilient just in terms of how vague and the platitude of multiple use. The Endangered Species Act, I think there is some agreement, although it would be sort of in whispers and behind closed doors, that it could be made more efficient. But I think there's very few of us that would question the goals and purposes of some of these statutes. Biological diversity, public participation, the democratization of environmental decision-making, these are all values. And I think certainly we've learned lessons over the years on how we could do it better. Like I've said, in an ideal, this is the longest, and I'm sorry, I'm go down this route, but it's something just I find fascinating. This is the longest period in American history we've not had a Public Lands Law Review Commission. We've had 4 of them in the past because we have this incredible, complicated patchwork of public land laws that don't really fit together. And the last time we convened a commission, something came out of that. And I've often reflected that maybe it's time to do that now, that we can find some increased efficiencies and effectiveness by writing better statutes. But I'm no longer in that camp. I just feel that today's political context is insane. And maybe that'll change in the near future, I don't know. But I would love to kind of build in a degree of resiliency and adaptability into these laws. And that's what I did. This is sort of the boring work that I did for 4 years for the Forest Service, is try to figure out how my whole motivation for spending all that time with the Forest Service, as they're terminating my research contract, was to figure out how we could just have more adaptive plans. And I'm not sure that was a good use of my time at this point, given those larger institutional forces. So, I don't know, Mo. It's like it's too soon to tell. I guess that's what.
It's a hard thing to. At what point do you measure that, and what are the methods to which you measure that?
Yeah.
Resilience to what? To when? At what point?
Yeah. I don't know. I think we're gonna.
Martin, I would just say I think it's a great presentation, but I think the title of your presentation might be off. I think you should say public and private lands, a love story, because I think if we're 70+% of this country is private lands, and 75% plus of wildlife use those private lands in some sort of their life cycle, we tend to want to silo these conversations, and at some point we need to come together as private and public lands and talk about those real issues together. And I think we just don't do that enough because we are so reliant on the benefits of public land, but vice versa. And I just think we get shoved off in a corner, and as long as we aren't together, we really can't have that big conversation.
No, thank you. And I love your private lands especially. That's right. I thought this would piqued some interest, the title. And again, I completely agree with you, and nowhere other than the Blackfoot is this happening successfully, so I commend you and all the work that you've done in that regard. But I wanted to put this in some context too, right? And I think that Irish grudge part of me, after the third debate with Senator Fielder, and seeing slide after slide of some of that Cormac McCarthy's The Road, I finally had enough. And I felt like there's maybe a more positive way. I don't know, Joanna asked me to come out of my policy zone, and I love public lands, and I think all of us do, and I think there's some hope maybe in just thinking about those memories, and it's something that binds us. And certainly for Rob's story, if you're going to run this, it's that public lands have been and can be a unifying force in the United States. You quote me on that one.